join me in welcoming Professor Michael Keall to the podium and to deliver his inaugural professorial lecture.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko kotirana te whakapaparanga mai, engari ko pai kakariki te kāinga, ko Michael Keall tōku ingoa, tēnā tātou katoa. So welcome to this lecture. Thanks to William and Neil for your kind introductions, and particularly to William for having to fill another role at the last minute. So it's often said it takes a village to raise a child. Equally, it takes a research group to raise a professor. So I'd like to acknowledge the efforts and talents of He Kāinga Oranga, the Housing and Health Research Program. I'd also like to acknowledge my Spanish whānau, the whānau that I've got through my wife Teresa, and also my Keall Galvin whānau here in Aotearoa. So the University of Otago is currently looking for a new Vice-Chancellor, and I won't say whether I've applied for the job or not, but I do have the pedigree, as this is my great-grandfather, Scottish-born Andrew Cameron, former Vice-Chancellor and Chancellor of the University of Otago, and founder of the famous Hall of Residence in Dunedin, Knox College. First, I'd better explain the title of my lecture. As Neil has already said, and William has also referred to it, I don't want to suggest that you can become a professor by accident. I know a lot of professors, and only one actually became a professor by accident. So this is very rare. So it takes a lot of deliberate effort and focus. Second, I've used the word accidents to refer to the research area of injury epidemiology. In the injury prevention world, the word accident has been replaced in most cases by other words. In road safety, we refer to a road crash rather than a road accident. And in home safety, we usually talk about a home injury rather than a home accident. And the reason for this is to help us think about injuries and crashes as having a systematic cause. In the case of a home injury, a person who falls may have been careless, they may have been hurrying or even drunk, but there are other factors that contribute. The focus of our work in the research program, He Kāinga Oranga, has been on the home environment, how it may contribute to risks of injury and how policies and regulations can reduce this risk. In this figure, I've listed a range of factors that affect home falls, but it is common for people to think of injuries as purely the fault of the injured person. In one of our studies of home injury, we interviewed people about what factors they thought had caused an injury they had suffered, and almost universally they talked about their behaviour, such as carelessness. Now, professors are famously pedantic, and some of you will be worried that I've spent the first 10 minutes explaining the title of my lecture. So you'll be pleased to know that I tried using ChatGPT with the instructions you see on the screen. The approach also fits well with the university's new policy of doing more with less. And this is what it produced. So this lecture took just seconds for artificial intelligence to write, but I'd have to rate it as a fail for a few reasons. First, there is no way I'd be talking for 40 minutes. There's 5 minutes here. The good news is that we would have been enjoying the kai earlier. Incidentally, there is kai following this, probably not a huge amount, but a bit. But it would have been disappointing in other ways. Secondly, it's not accurate. I've not done research regarding muscle weakness, balance deficits, and medication usage. I've done a lot of research in environmental hazards, and this has been the focus of my home injury work. which I'll explain soon. So given that ChatGPT was happy to invent a whole lot of stuff, it is surprising that it couldn't come up with more than the 671 words that you see here. So instead, I prepared a lecture focusing on some key studies where I took a significant role. My first chance to lead a significant bit of analysis came after this trial was announced. In 1997, the Transport Minister, Jenny Shipley, announced the start of a trial of hidden speed cameras. Before this, the cameras had been used in a highly visible manner, which usually gave drivers plenty of time to slow down and avoid a fine. The trial was a controlled experiment using an intervention area where the hidden cameras would be used, in contrast with the rest of New Zealand where speed enforcement was as before. A huge amount of work would have been involved in setting up the trial by people such as my boss at the time, Bill Frith, who's in the audience. Welcome, Bill. As conducting research is not often a priority of government ministries. It is still harder when collaboration is required, in this case, between the Ministry of Transport, the police, and the Land Transport Authority, where I was working at the time. So to refresh your memories, these are what the speed camera signs looked like. The signs marked the beginning of the speed camera sites. Each were about 3 kilometres long, and there were over 1,000 signposted sites throughout New Zealand, and the cameras were operated out of police cars or vans. In this picture, we don't see any obvious place where a speed camera could be hidden, but further along the road there was a large macrocarpentry where a police car could hide. The results of the trial were quite compelling, showing reductions in speeds, reductions in crash and injury rates, and even growing public acceptance. Public acceptance was seen as being quite important, as some people thought that hiding the speed cameras was unfair or sneaky. This shows the distribution of speeds of cars as measured at the roadside sites in the intervention and the control areas during the trial. And before the trial, those two lines you see were almost identical, they overlapped. One compelling feature of these graphs is the fact that more than half of all the drivers were exceeding the speed limit, and often by quite a lot. So you can see the speeds along the horizontal axis. This study provides a good example of how a large scale, although relatively small change in speeds can lead to quite impressive injury savings, in this case of 19%. This figure shows how speeds changed from before the trial to during the trial. So this is a change in kilometres per hour. The 85th percentile speeds are the speeds over which the fastest 15% of drivers are travelling. So these statistics were quite compelling. However, the public can sometimes get annoyed at a public health measure that is focused on everyone, particularly if it affects them personally. And they also don't think they are the problem. When we released the results of the trial, we got some very abusive messages. At the time, I was surprised because, from my point of view, I was well qualified to do the analysis, and I was just doing my job. I had nothing invested in the results. So I wasn't a self-serving public servant, in my view. And while the trial was running, I received this in the post. So ironically, I'd been caught speeding in the trial that I was evaluating. So this illustrates a couple of problems in road safety. First, information does not necessarily lead to behaviour change. So I was very aware of the laws of physics with regard to speed. The forces imposed in a crash increase proportionately to the square of the speed, and the same applies to stopping distances. Many studies have shown that crash risk increases with speed, and I knew this. And I'll show you some graphs later on, incidentally. However, it is very common for drivers to think they are safer than average, as shown in this graph. Some studies have found that almost 90% think they are better than average. So logically, it is other drivers who should change their behaviour, not you personally. After getting the fine, you'll be pleased to know that I did drive more slowly. Not long afterwards, the Land Transport Safety Authority was disbanded and my job was transferred to the Ministry of Transport. When I searched the Ministry of Transport annual report at the time, I discovered that the word research did not appear at all. As I'd recently completed my PhD at the Monash University Accident Research Centre in injury epidemiology, the lack of interest in research was a worry. I therefore looked around for other work in the newspaper, which is what you did then, and I saw that the University of Otago, Wellington, was looking for a research fellow. The subject area was housing, which I wasn't particularly interested in at the time, but I decided to take a risk. One of the first projects I did with He Kāinga Oranga was to use travel survey data to see how much time New Zealanders spend in different places. Statistics New Zealand also have a time use survey, but children were not included in the survey. And as you can see from the graph, young children and also older adults spend most of their time in their homes, approaching 90%. So this is a very important group for housing research. This graph has become one of the more useful pieces of background information for the housing and health research because it shows that in terms of duration of time, our homes are extremely important. So because of the large amount of time we spend at home, poor quality housing is likely to have a large effect on us, and more so for children and older people. Children and older people are also more vulnerable to many of the health conditions affected by poor housing. Another first project in my new job was to work on developing the Healthy Housing Index, which was a way of measuring how well New Zealand homes perform with respect to health and safety. Here is a list of features in homes relevant to injury risk. I don't think you can read them all, but I'm listing them just so that you can see that there are a lot of them. We conducted inspections of around 1,000 homes and matched addresses to ACC claims for the home injuries requiring medical treatment. And we estimated a dose-response curve, which you see here, showing that injury rates when the number of injury hazards increased. So the injury rate, of course, is in the vertical axis there. Later on, I met with some of the injury prevention staff at ACC to discuss this work. And Michael Baker, who's in the audience now, one of the directors at the time of He Kāinga Oranga, was there too. At the meeting, he surprised me by suggesting that it would be useful to run a randomised controlled trial to see whether removing or fixing injury hazards in homes would really prevent injury. The ACC people were enthusiastic. I was alarmed because this sort of study sounded very difficult to run. But the research group that I joined had already run 2 other randomised controlled trials involving insulating and heating New Zealand homes. And this is Philippa Howden-Chapman talking at a hui about the insulation study, which had results published in 2007. So the team I joined had a track record with running these difficult and demanding studies. After quite a lot of work, we managed to get funding from the Health Research Council of New Zealand to run a large randomised controlled trial. Most of the money in the research grant was to pay for safety modifications to homes. And shown in this picture are some fairly typical access steps to homes. I'll see whether I can get my mouse to work. Yes. So, as I said, fairly typical steps. You can see that these steps are in the shade. Probably there's some sort of mould or moss growing on them, which makes them slippery. They'll be wet. These are in Taranaki, so of course it rains a lot. No handrail. So if you fall on these slippery steps, you're quite likely to land on the concrete below. So this is actually quite a serious hazard and quite a common one. By looking at the literature, we decided on a set of practical and relatively low-cost repairs of common home fall hazards. The survey that we'd carried out using the Healthy Housing Index had shown what common modifications were needed to make homes safer. The general method used in the HIPPY study had been tried and tested in the previous trials, so there was nothing particularly new about this. And as with the previous trials, for reasons of fairness, we carried out the safety modifications in half the sample at the beginning, but then also modified the control homes after 3 years had passed. This is Josh Shanley, the builder, carrying out some of the modifications. The study would not have been possible without the fine work done by him and his team of builders, coordinated by Emily Shanley. The unsung heroes of these trials have been people like the Shanleys and also the community trusts who were involved in this trial, and also the MIPI trial that followed. So I'd like to acknowledge the fine work also of Wise Better Homes, led by Anaru Marshall, and of the Sustainability Trust in Wellington, led by Phil Squire. In the HIPPY trial, around 95% of people agreed to have their homes modified. This was one of the reasons the trial succeeded. A recent large-scale trial of home modification in another country failed, probably because fewer than half of the people in the trial actually had the modifications done. So the cooperation rate was key. We published the results in The Lancet in 2015, and the main result was a 26% reduction in injuries from falls because of the home modifications we carried out. As we wanted to make the intervention easy to put into practice so that as many people as possible could avoid injury, we did a cost-benefit analysis showing that the benefits of the trial were so much higher than the costs that a national rollout of the intervention was a no-brainer. We did some modelling of the costs borne by ACC and showed that the costs were reduced by even more than the injuries themselves, by about 1/3. Following the trial, we held hui in the areas we had studied and invited people to make comments and provide feedback. This helped us identify some problems with the safety modifications. One was what was probably a cost-saving measure, where only the middle part of the step was fitted with edgings, unlike the steps you see in that picture. This resulted in some exposed, sharp aluminium edges. Once we realised this potential safety issue, we returned to all the homes with this modification and fixed the sharp edges. And in subsequent work, we made sure the entire step was fitted with the edgings, like in the photo. Another aspect that caused concern was this product, which attaches to bathroom and shower walls using suction cups. This would often work for a period and then fail unexpectedly, which is a major concern. We subsequently used grab rails that were permanently fixed to walls. We think this particular product should not be available for sale because it's clearly unsafe. We installed a lot of outside lighting, such as shown here. The advantage of powering lights with solar panels supported by batteries is that the installation costs are reduced by a lot as there's no wiring to the house. A lot of the lights we installed early on in the trial failed following wet weather, so these were clearly not fit for purpose. And finally, a large proportion of the houses we visited did not have working smoke detectors, and so we installed them. not because it was part of the intervention, but because we had people there to do it. The cheap detectors have a battery with a short life, and this battery often does not get replaced when it fails. An obvious solution is a product with a 10-year battery life. The detectors with a short battery life should probably not be considered fit for purpose and therefore shouldn't really be sold. Sorry, I'm not really a free marketer with respect to this. So the HIPPY study was a world first of its kind. And one of the reasons that we found such a large reduction in injuries is that our housing is so unsafe. And it is ironic that one of the reasons that the various randomised controlled trials run by He Kāinga Oranga, one of the reasons I've been so impressive and world leading is the fact that our housing is poor in terms of its ability to protect us from cold and damp and also from the risk of falls. The Māori Home Injury Prevention Intervention Study, or MIPI, was led by Massey University's Chris Cunningham, and it was another extremely important study, particularly when considered alongside the HIPPY study, which did include some Māori, but mostly non-Māori. The study had a similar design to the HIPPY, but with better implementation following the sorts of learnings I've just described. And it showed even more impressive safety benefit. So one of the most important learnings from this was not only that home modification is a way of reducing injury for everyone, the fact that it is more effective for Māori means that it can address some of the injury inequity that we see in Aotearoa, New Zealand. When the HIPPY was first conceived, the government had rolled out the Warm Up New Zealand program described in this slide. It provided subsidies for making our homes warmer by retrofitting insulation and later efficient heating. This policy was justified by the gold standard evidence provided by the research group, showing the clear health benefits and also the clear benefit costs ratios. There were also secondary economic benefits of employing a large workforce dedicated to fitting insulation. We hoped that a similar scheme could arise out of the HIPPY and MIPI studies, which had shown even stronger evidence. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened. So more than 100,000 injuries from falls happen in New Zealand every year that could have been prevented by such an intervention if it had been rolled out in all New Zealand homes. This figure comes from some subsequent work done by Lynn Riggs. We've also seen the enactment of the Healthy Home Standards, which may be unpopular with landlords, but makes sense in terms of keeping tenants healthier by ensuring that rental housing meets minimum standards. It was a missed opportunity that standards for preventing injury were not included in this legislation. This could have improved safety for thousands of people renting homes in New Zealand and reduced some of the injury inequities we currently suffer. This is another sign that we do not have strong injury prevention advocacy that can influence policy in New Zealand. When talking to injury prevention colleagues overseas, I find it embarrassing that we are doing so little about our high injury rates despite the gold standard evidence we have in front of us. Now for something completely different. Another important strand to my research work has been with the Centre for Sustainable Cities, and this work has been focused on what is part of a major problem in New Zealand, our low rates of cycling and walking, which is part of our low rates of physical activity. And this means we're missing out on some of the health benefits of walking and cycling. And of course, our cities are clogged with cars. In terms of active travel rates, New Zealand has very low rates internationally. Although the figures shown in this graph are old, both for New Zealand, these are from the 2013 census, and for other countries shown, but our position is still near the bottom. Shown here is how we rate in terms of obesity. Our falling rates of active travel is part of the cause of increasing obesity rates and associated illnesses such as type 2 diabetes. So there is an important rationale that getting people cycling and walking rather than driving can reduce some of these issues that I've just talked about, but also reduce carbon emissions and boost the vitality of towns and cities. So in this context, the Model Communities program in Hastings and New Plymouth was an important experiment to see the effects of increased investment in walking and cycling. I will now describe our evaluation of the Model Communities program, which we called the Active Study, and that was funded in part by an Endeavour grant from MB. So here are some aspects of the Model Communities program. So this is part of the intervention. So here we see a cycleway, I think it was for both cyclists and pedestrians, so this was new. This was a new bridge, also part of the network of cycling and walking paths. There were also activities. Here's an organised activity, obviously, for people on scooters, children on scooters mainly. This must be the opening of one of the cycling paths. Looks like a cold day. And here are some school children making use of some of the painted lines on roads, which is not really my favourite form of cycling infrastructure. And you can see why someone involved in injury epidemiology might be a little bit worried. Particularly these kids near the back, riding side by side. And this particular cycling and pedestrian bridge, the Te Rewa Bridge in New Plymouth, this would have cost a lot of money, but it frames the maunga Taranaki when you stand at this end of the bridge, unless the maunga is hidden by cloud, which is quite common. So we evaluated the Model Communities program using what is perhaps the best design for natural experiments, by taking measurements of travel before the program started and then 3 times subsequently. We also used matched control areas, which were Whanganui and Masterton. So just to summarise the summary that I've got here, Hastings and New Plymouth successfully created new cycling infrastructure and encouraged active travel using a mixture of promotion, activities and traffic calming. Over the period we were studying, there were falling rates of cycling and walking nationwide, which was also true of the control cities. So the increases we found in walking and cycling rates were impressive, but these were in comparison with the falling rates in the control cities. So when publishing the results, we used the language you see here. The Model Communities program can be regarded as successful in arresting a strong trend towards ever-decreasing levels of active travel. As we hope that government makes decisions that are rational, we provided a rationale for rolling out this investment more widely. And these are the headline results of the economic analysis led by Rafe Chapman, who's here today. Like the HIPPY study, these results are very compelling with an 11-to-1 benefit to cost ratio and should provide a firm basis for this sort of investment. Some further analysis we did provided another very compelling rationale for the program, as it is likely to address some of the health inequities we face in New Zealand. So we were able to make one final set of measurements of travel in 2016, 5 years after the baseline, and this enabled us to see whether the changes were being sustained, which generally they were, although perhaps diminishing a bit. This also gave us enough data to look more closely at the changes in rates and consider some impacts on equity. Incidentally, in the graphs I'm showing, the vertical lines are 95% confidence intervals. So it shows how much the estimates can be considered to vary. And shorter lines indicate greater precision, and where the confidence interval does not include 1, the change is considered statistically significant in the intervention cities relative to the controls. So as you can see, those confidence intervals did not include 1, so these were statistically significant. Now the scale of this graph has changed from the previous one because there are some larger values, but it also shows a sustained effect associated with the program and a much larger effect for Māori. The Māori are represented by the solid blue line here. And of course the confidence intervals are larger for Māori because we had fewer in our study. There was also a much larger effect for households below the median income. This is the solid line shown. So to summarise, the effects on equity of the Model Communities program are encouraging, as they have the potential to help reduce some of the health inequities suffered by people on lower incomes and also by Māori. As also found in studies internationally, people are more likely to walk and cycle for transport if they have walking and cycling paths near their homes. In the Model Communities program, there appears to have been a deliberate effort to make sure that lower income areas were well served by the investment. The third and final part of my lecture covers some of my collaboration with Monash University, my work for hire. For almost 2 decades, I've been working as a consultant on Monash University's Vehicle Safety Research Program. This is led by Professor Stuart Newstead, and it uses large databases of crash and injury data linked to information on vehicles and their safety features. These are some of the safety metrics that the group produces each year, and these are updated to use the most recent crash data available. So the number of vehicles rated is continually increasing as we get more data. So there are ratings of safety features that prevent a crash from happening in the first place, which are called active or primary safety features, and also ratings of the way the vehicle protects occupants or reduces injuries for other road users once the crash happens. This graph, the years are extremely small and you probably can't see them, but they're along the horizontal axis, and they range from 1963 up to 2017, but the trend has continued. And in the vertical axis we have crash worthiness. So it tracks the safety improvements over time as vehicle manufacturers made vehicles progressively more safe. Crashworthiness is a measure of the protection that the vehicle provides when involved in a crash. And this is the rate of fatal and serious injury once a crash occurs. So smaller values are good. They indicate safer vehicles. I will now show a brief video, if the technology works out, which I think it will, about autonomous emergency braking to protect pedestrians. This is a recent technology, and it's only available on fairly recently manufactured vehicles. So I'll go here. And So the thing about the braking system that you were seeing there was that the driver was not applying the brakes, it was the vehicle. So that's the significant thing about it. So there's no way that a driver could have responded in that time and prevented the collision, or not in one case. So this paper that I'll talk briefly about now, this has become one of the most cited publications I've been involved with. The reason for this is that it was the first study to evaluate what was an emerging safety technology at the time, which was the technology you saw there, but this was to prevent vehicle-to-vehicle collisions or vehicle-to-object collisions. So the pedestrian safety aspect was more recent. So, well, once again, a bit like the first study that I described, a lot of the work was done behind the scenes. It's very hard to get different countries to provide data to collaborate, so that was actually not done by me. It was done by Professor Brian Fildes from Monash. But it was actually necessary to do it that way because the technology was quite new. We had very little data to deal with, because you need crashes if you're going to analyse the real world effectiveness of something. So the result we found was a 38% reduction, which was a very good result. And and the problem often with some of these new technologies is that they can look good in a lab, they can look good to the technicians, but once they get a chance to be used in the field, there can be a different story. So now I'm starting to run out of time, partly because we started late. So I'll briefly summarise some other studies, usually using mainly graphs. And this is also very useful for anybody who's doing NCEA Level 1. So this graph, it's from a study I'd no role in, but it shows urban speeds are incredibly important. And there's been some debate during the current election campaign around raising speed limits. And it has been asserted that this will benefit the economy. Now, if you consider health and environmental outcomes, raising speed limits will in fact harm the economy. And this is a graph showing pedestrian fatality risk according to impact speeds from a paper by Hussein and colleagues that synthesized the findings of a number of studies. And the red line in this graph is their meta-analysis. So this shows how important it is to reduce speed limits, particularly in areas where pedestrians and cars are interacting. So at 50 kilometres per hour, the top line you see, which is the speed limit of many of our urban roads, around 1/3 of all pedestrians hit by a vehicle will die, and many more will suffer injuries that will affect them for the rest of their lives. By reducing the speed to around 40 kilometres per hour, only around 1 in 8 pedestrians struck will die. At 30 kilometres per hour, the bottom line you see, only around 1 in 20 will die. So that's a very substantial reduction. And these deaths and injuries carry both a social and an economic cost. And any increase in speed limits will increase death and injury. It's just one of the rules of physics. Now, in this study led by Caroline Shaw, hi Caroline, we modelled the health effects of increasing walking, cycling and public transport in the larger New Zealand cities. So there are real economic benefits of improving our cities in terms of public transport, cycling infrastructure and walkability, and these arise through improvements in health. Reduced speed limits were part of the Model Communities program and an essential measure to promote physical activity as well as reducing road injury. And apologies to Hamilton, but it is one city where They need to improve quite a lot. This graph shows the risk of road injury for drivers according to blood alcohol level, which is shown in the horizontal axis. The curves are for various studies, including a New Zealand study, which I led, which has the dark solid line. Now, the curve is always steeper for fatal injury risk, and this is partly because consuming alcohol actually affects your survivability in a crash. And this paper helped lower the legal limit for alcohol in New Zealand from 80 as it was to 50, which is its current level. In that study, we also found an interaction with age where the younger drivers had a much higher risk. So this helped justify the zero limit for young drivers. This analysis, which I did along with Bill Frith when I was at the Land Transport Safety Authority 2 decades ago, and it shows the driver risk of injury crash involvement by driver age on different road types. So driver age is in the horizontal axis, and the different road types are the different lines. So one of the reasons that older drivers appear to have an elevated risk of crash, well, they do have an elevated risk of crash, is that they drive much more on higher risk urban roads. Another important factor is their fragility. So a crash that might only cause minor injuries to a young person can cause much more serious injuries to an older person. So this analysis helped ditch the older driver licensing scheme, and this was where older people were required to undertake a practical driver licensing test every 2 years from the time the driver turns 80. And this test was very stressful to many people, and it led to many older people giving up driving prematurely, leading to greater social isolation. I'm giving you sort of just a sample of a few studies. There are many more I could go on with. This is an analysis of risk of crash involvement by vehicle age in the early years of this century, when vehicles were required to have a 6-monthly warrant of fitness inspection from age 7 onwards. And the analysis showed that there was a reduction in risk at the time that the frequency of the inspections doubled. So you can see that here. Well, it's really a reduction in the risk that you would expect if the trend had continued. However, we did an economic analysis to consider the costs of the 6-monthly inspections compared to the crash reduction benefits, and this showed that there was not a good economic justification for having the 6-monthly inspections. And these results helped justify the removal of the requirement to have vehicles inspected every 6 months. So I'm now at the end of this professorial lecture. So to conclude, you may have noticed some repeated themes. So I've talked about uptake or lack of uptake of research. Public health research becomes useful when it leads to change that in turn benefits health and safety. And our research in doing this, our strategy in doing this research was quite deliberate. First, we did the research in a way that we thought would work and would produce results that could make a difference. Secondly, we attempted to make our research relevant to policy decisions by looking at aspects that could feed into a business case, including costs and benefits. Third, we tried to implement the research so that the participants felt compensated in some way for their time. We wanted them to benefit from the studies we conducted, and this last aspect would have helped to get the high cooperation rates that lead to high quality research. And finally, we tried to consider implementation issues in conversation with stakeholders. And that's the end.